Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on QSRA Introduction for Risk Planning Professionals and Decision Makers. Today's event is sponsored by Safran Software, a little bit more of that in a moment. So just to let you know who you are actually speaking to, my name's Tony McDonald. I work for Costain and I will be doing the short introduction followed by some words on QSRA's best practice and what we need from a schedule for QSRA. And then James Kimantz from Jacobs will talk about uncertainty and risk in QSRA. And then we'll finish off with Graham Nicol from Turner and Townsend, who will be talking about outputs, what they are, what they mean, and what we then need to be able to do to inform decision makers. So this is a joint webinar from the APM, APM Risk SIG and PMC SIGs. So on behalf of the chairman of those two SIGs, I welcome you to the event today. I'd just like to pay thanks to Maya and Anna from the APM who've helped out us as presenters and the wider team that's put this together, certainly with the technology, so thank you to them. And also to the members of both SIGs who supported the presenters and done good work in the background about making today happen. As I said earlier, the webinar today is sponsored by Safran Software. Safran Software has long been recognised as a leading provider of project control software with a special emphasis on risk management. It is for this reason that Safran is especially happy to sponsor and be aligned with this webinar. Based in Norway, but with offices in many international centres and with a worldwide partner network, Safran has provided the very latest project control software for 25 years. The power of quantitative risk analysis, QSRA, is embedded in both the scheduling and dedicated risk managed tools provided, and adds another level of confidence to the planning, resourcing and execution of complex projects. Risk thought leaders around the world have adopted Safran Risk as the leading application of choice for complex projects. An example of this is the risk assessment tool designed by Safran in partnership with Hewlett and Associates. This free-to-use assessment measures a project's level of risk preparedness across 4 sectors: scheduling competence, risk awareness, and qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. Anyone attending this webinar with an interest in the latest risk analytics and techniques can try this assessment free of charge on Safran's website. So again, thank you again for Safran for their support. And just before we begin the meat of the webinar, just a couple of adverts from the wider APM community from the two SIGs. There's a Risk SIG Conference 2019, Using Risk to Influence the Future, which is due to take place in Birmingham on the 26th of March. There's the advert. Please go to the APM website for details of how to book a place, etc. And finally, before we start, the PMC SIG has an evening event for an evening student conference event today at University College London, the East Here campus. Again, that is in London. It's this evening. So if you're in London this evening and want to attend that event, then please again go to the APM events section of the main website for details. Okay, so that takes us through all the admin and welcomes. So without further ado, I will now speak for roughly about 15 minutes on QSRA, why is it best practice, what should decision makers be thinking about, and what do we need from our scheduling colleagues, but working together with our scheduling colleagues to be able to do a good QSRA. So why is QSRA best practice, and what do decision makers need from it? So dealing with the first question, okay, QSRA really provides us with a methodology that answers 3 key questions concerning overrunning project schedules. Firstly, can overruns be predicted with some degree of accuracy? Please be aware that QSRA is not going to provide you with 100% answers. It is better than a guess, but it is not absolute fact. But you're going to get a degree of accuracy and indication from it that, again, will help you to answer this question. Can causes of risk be identified up front, helping the project to stop them happening by taking effective response actions? Okay, very key and important that we understand, as we all know on our projects, that we identify risk, threat / opportunity as soon as possible in the project, so we can get on about doing something about it, so we can either make the threat not happen or realize the opportunity. And finally, can we, I talked to myself and my colleagues on this presentation, as risk professionals, determine the causes of why projects frequently overrun their initial schedules. Okay, and again, QSRA is a very good tool technique that we can use to answer that question. So therefore, looking across the piece, overwhelmingly, the answer is yes. QSRA as best practice can really help projects and the wider project community and decision makers answer those 3 key questions, which, as we all know through bitter experience, come up again and again and again. QSRA also head-on answers or addresses head-on the fact that we don't know how long activities will take. We've all worked on projects where someone has said, oh, well, this is exactly the same as the project we did 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago. However, even on very similar projects, they look similar, they feel similar, there'll always be differences. Things like the management style, the personnel, they'll be different, they'll manage things differently. And this, again, can affect how long we believe activity will take. And again, that's why even on a project where everybody goes, oh, I know exactly what I'm doing, QSRA is best practice, because things, no matter how small, do change. QSRA also allows investigation of activity uncertainty, and uncertainty in its broadest sense, to establish the overall effect it has on a project schedule. We need to be able, it also allows the project to answer the following questions that allows us as a project management community, schedulers, risk professionals, etc., to provide decision makers with good quality output that they can then make decisions influenced by and make good decisions. So those questions are, and again, if you're a decision maker out there today, these are the questions you need to be asking as well. And these are questions that the project management community, the project control community need to be answering for you. How likely is the project to achieve the key dates and milestones in the schedule? How much schedule contingency is needed to provide an acceptable degree of certainty around the schedule? We don't want too much, we don't want too little. Again, QSRA is right at the core of being able to help us answer this type of question. And finally, where is the greatest risk in the schedule? And that can be by area, by work package, however you split your schedule down. And we can also identify individual threats and opportunities that could either impact or benefit the schedule itself. So these are key questions that risk professionals, schedulers, etc., need to be asking themselves, and key questions that decision makers need to be asking of those professional communities. And finally, about decision making, the QSRA provides a strong indication. Personally, I always, when I talk about what comes out of analysis, talk about outputs, not results, not answers, etc., because those tend to have a degree of certainty that, you know, they don't have. It gives you a strong indication to key decision makers of what the key activities and the key risks are that will impact the project if they don't manage the project correctly. Okay, so it's really, really important that we are answering that question for decision makers and key senior project personnel, and that they're asking and getting that from us. Okay, so moving on from best practice, I now want to talk about the project schedule itself. The title slide there is really, I could have just put that up. So the title there is really, you know, you could have just put one bullet up and talked about it. But that is so true for all of you out there who have done QSRA risk professionals, those who've contributed, or those who are brand new to this. QSRA is based on a good project schedule. Okay, absolutely fundamental. So what does that mean in a little bit more detail? The first thing I want to talk about is certainly to our scheduling colleagues and to my fellow risk professionals, is scheduling is a difficult and challenging discipline. Okay, it is difficult. You don't have all the information. People are always changing things, etc., etc. So it's really important that, and vital, that the project's risk and scheduling functions work closely together. It is absolutely fundamental. Please, schedulers, don't think that the risk function's coming along to find holes and criticise your schedule. That is not what we're there. We're there to work together so we can do a good QSRA, and doing a QSRA, going back to the title of this slide, will make the project schedule better and make it a good one. Okay, but when we're doing that, working together, we must fully involve project managers and decision makers from the start. Okay, we want to make sure that they are seeing QSRA as good practice, as something that's going to benefit and help them and assist them, and not a black box sort of technique that frightens them and sort of is seen as being bad news. So when we're doing that, in terms of that work we're doing together as a scheduling and risk functions, we're building, there's two ways here. We're building a high-level analysis network derived from the project schedule itself, or we would improve and then use the schedule itself for the QSRA. Just this little bit thing there is that, James will be talking about this a little bit more in his presentation, or in his bit of the webinar, is that if you have a very good schedule, even though it's a fantastic schedule, it meets all the criteria, but it's 10 to 20,000 lines long, it's not necessarily actually suited to be able to do a QSRA. So a high-level analysis network may need to be built. However, if your schedule, and James will talk about the numbers, is in terms of a manageable number of activities, then you can improve and use the schedule itself. And that again is, both of those have to be done, whichever one we do, closely together between the risk and schedule functions. And it's really important for us as risk professionals, for those out there who are risk managers or risk analysts or whatever your title is, that we utilise the scheduler's knowledge of the project schedule to ensure that when all areas are explored for potential risk. We must work with our scheduling colleagues because they know the schedule better than we do, and they know where are those dark little corners into which we as risk managers need to go and shine a light. So, what is it we need in order to be able to do a QSRA? What are the criteria we need for either our high-level analysis network, or for our project schedule if it's not too big. Okay, so as I said, James will be talking a few about this in a little bit more detail, but the idea is, please don't think that if we're producing a separate network that it is different or not in accordance with the schedule. It must mirror the schedule. And actually, the criteria I'm about to run through in the last few moments of my bit of the webinar are very much so good best practice scheduling. Okay, so there is nothing here that the QSRA team needs from the schedule that is not already good scheduling practice. So we need a left to right logic driven network or schedule. We need to make sure that we're using the right type of predecessors and successors. Finish to start or start to finish for predecessors, finish to start, finish to finish for successors. What if we produce a analysis network? It is not a rolled up project schedule. So don't think you can just sort of click on the summary task and there's your project schedule. It is not that. Okay, it's not rolled up. If it is a separate analysis network, it will need to be developed together so that it is a good reflection or / development of the overall schedule. Overall activity durations and dates must match the project schedule. If you're producing a network, obviously if you're using the schedule itself, then obviously they will. But please do not have a network, if you build one, that does not match those dates and durations, because you are not modeling that schedule. There must be the minimal, ideally, in fact, not ideally, but actually really no use of constraints, especially late date constraints. The more constrained a network or schedule is, the less effective the outputs of the QSRA will be, because as it's running through and running the different scenarios, those dates are not moving. Okay, so we're not seeing the impact of risk and uncertainty on the schedule. Okay, please, no dangling logic, the danglers, to use that slightly dodgy expression. Again, certainly, again, within a schedule, you really shouldn't have that many dangling activities and etc. And certainly in a network, the only one without a successor should be obviously the end milestone of the network that we're modeling, and the only one without a predecessor obviously should be the start date of that particular network. And again, this is good practice for all schedulers, as our scheduling colleagues know. And then finally, we must have the minimal use, or in fact no use, of lags and leads being negative lag. Again, that constrains the effectiveness of the outputs. Lag really needs to be recognized if it's activity, etc. And obviously negative lag or leads is if you're saying that you're going to start something before the thing that it needs to finish allows it to start. That's what I call a time machine, because obviously you can't start something before the predecessor is finished. Okay, that concludes my part of the webinar. So I'd now like to hand over to James Kimmants from Jacobs, who will discuss uncertainty and risk in QSRA. So over to you, James.
Hello, hello everyone. Thank you, Tony. That was most interesting. And what I'd like to do now is move on and talk about uncertainty and risk in QSRAs. With the required content, we've got a simple introduction, looking at a simplified process, and work my way through a set of cautionary observations and benefits. But concentrating on what is uncertainty and risk within a QSRA. We've already had Tony talk at length and also in quite a lot of detail about the benefits and the reasons that we want to do a QSRA, about it being best practice. So all I'll do is just summarize some of what I see as the key issues here, is that we're actually using it to provide a risk-based confidence forecast of key milestones, not just the end date, but points within that schedule. And we also want to support quantification of a project schedule and cost contingency requirements from the analyses and our outputs. I will talk about benefits and behaviors later on, but it also drives a lot of very good behaviors within the project and how the project team starts to think and interact. I think it's important to state at this point that there are a wide variety of tools available to carry out this analysis. These range from Oracle PRA, which has been around for quite some years, and the more recent Acumen Fuse Risk and Safran Risk, which we heard about at the in the beginning of the introduction, who using newer software capabilities actually provide quite a few dimensions in terms of assessing that information and providing it in formats which are suitable to decision makers. On this topic area, when you actually start hunting through literature, there is a vast amount of literature, and a lot of it's very, very good, and a lot of it are very, very good guidelines. Hewlett, Hilston, there's the Americans with their schedule assessment guide, the GAO, and of course APM has actually touched on this subject in various publications as well. So the aim here isn't to actually recreate that. The aim here is to sort of give us a quick start introduction guide and maybe highlight some do's, maybes, and don'ts that we might be wise to consider when we undertake this process. So, a simplified process, and what I've tried to do here is capture this as a flow diagram going from left to right on your screens, and it's very, very simplified. And I would note that down beneath in grey, those aren't going to be covered here today, but they are steps that, as you go into a more advanced analysis, that you might undertake. But effectively, we have our schedule preparation, then we move into assigning activity uncertainties within that schedule. We start to look at our risks and make sure our risks are suitable for analysis. In other words, do we have values for those? What are their distributions? And where would we assign them within that schedule? And then we have some of the functionality within the typical softwares, which is most important, is this schedule health check, which looks at some of the areas that Tony was talking about earlier. And then, of course, we can run the analyses. Now, within this flow diagram, you may run the schedule health check on multiple occasions while you're still developing your schedule. Could be wise rather than trying to do it all in one big hit at the end. And also, running analyses can also provide information that you might want to use to actually structure your schedule better, or maybe reconsider some of your risks and some of your activities and how you actually do things. So it's an interactive cyclical process. So all looks very, very straightforward, but with all things that seem to do with risk these days, although it looks straightforward, it isn't always that straightforward, and it's certainly not that simple. And Tony has actually talked about the schedule preparation, and I'll just mention here is that he's 100% right about the fact that it is a significant task undertaken by very competent schedulers who are experienced normally in working with risk managers to actually deliver this product at the end of the day. So that's already been covered by, you can't stress it more than to say that it's like the foundations of a house. You get that wrong and everything else is going to follow in a rather higgledy-piggledy sort of manner. So moving on from that, you then have your uncertainties and your risks. And this is where we get into the old cliche where we all seem to intuitively understand what risk is. And out there in the documents that are floating around, quite often they're from the project disciplines. And so they're not just people that don't understand the subject. There isn't necessarily a consistency about understanding between risk and uncertainty. So let's just have a quick look at some of that, a quick recap. Risk, we're all pretty familiar with. There's a lot of material in the space about that. There's quite a few variations. Generally these days they seem to be coming down to a very, very similar sort of description or definition. Here I've basically put down the APM's version from PMBOK, which is pretty standardized. But I think if you drill in that and you break it down, typically they're event-based, quantifiable, and they've got probabilities of occurrence and how they impact upon the project. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is a little bit more nebulous. There is basically, as it implies, there is a lack of uncertainty, i.e. you're not knowing for sure. So, and this is all about the information you may or may not have, or the conflicting information that you may have. So, breaking that down again, the common themes here are either an absence of information, an unknowing, a variability, an ambiguity, a lack of clarity, and there is some sort of degree of randomness. In other words, it's uncertain because there are so many small or possibly prevalent things that can occur that makes it sort of random about some sort of midpoint. So using that, you can sort of come down to two ways of actually assessing whether we're actually trying to capture an uncertainty or a risk. And effectively, a risk is a discrete event with a probability of an occurrence. And it's only felt if the event occurs. Whereas uncertainty, as applied to activities, is an occurrence that has no probability, and you know that you don't know the actual value. So there is going to be some sort of range. So you have a feeling for what it might be, but you know that for whatever reasons, that randomness is out there, and you can't necessarily quantify that. So typically, these are normal activities, business as usual, and there's going to be some variability about them. The variability can be captured as a range, i.e. min, max, most likely, or what your expected values are based upon your experience. So with this in mind, we've now got to create that data and put it into the model. As Tony has already mentioned, the key players here are the scheduler and the risk manager, but it's very important not to put those two individuals or that team of individuals into isolation, because really driving behind all of this is the subject matter experts. They are the people that can provide that information about the distributions and the uncertainties, etc., and the project management team that are helping to drive this. So they must be involved in any form of reviewing and assigning values to the schedule and the risk register. In terms of estimating uncertainty across the great number of activities, you definitely need that SME knowledge, but you may also, with the volume of information you require and depending on your time scale, start looking at templating, i.e. looking at groups of activities, whether they be civils, M&E, ICT, new technology. The list could be endless. But what you try to do is you try to gather ranges which you might apply in terms of a plus or minus percentage around a midpoint, and you can apply those. So that means you can apply information and gather information and use it as effectively as possible. Continuing on with the model and the data, you need to start looking at your risks. And one key element of risks is assumptions. In other words, you do an assumptions analysis, and where necessary, where those are significant, you capture the risks. You need to review your existing risk register. Not all risks that are being captured in a register that's generated very early on and necessarily suitable for putting into your analysis. When you've done all of that and you've defined your probabilities about the data that you actually have, you then start to map these to your schedule model. Now, this all requires significant resources, but there will be significant benefits. I have one or two observations to make here. Schedule and uncertainty data are the key building blocks upon that QSRA. So we don't want to skimp on those, creating the right size schedule which we're going to fit it into. And we certainly don't want to be not challenging that information with our subject matter experts. And most importantly, it's not just a question of dumping risks from a general risk register into the model. That will normally end up with the wrong risks being assigned to the wrong places. You need to really consider that information. Things that you definitely don't want to do, and it's something that many of us see, we're under pressure to either get a bid in or the next stage gate or whatever, is we leave the process until the last minute. Or ideally when we've got a really good schedule. What this does is it puts the whole of what we're talking about and building these resources in, we push them until the last part of the exercise. It almost becomes tick box because you're not getting the benefits of challenging the schedule and looking at it and deciding whether these are real values. And one thing that quite often happens when you leave it until the last minute is the fact that the answer you get you just don't like, but unfortunately you've now got to submit it, and at that point you end up in all sorts of situations whereby you potentially try to game the results, which is not what you want to be doing with a QSRA, because quite often you get caught out. The benefits. You need benefits because to do a QSRA properly, you start looking at your, you start consuming resources. So even at the early stage, overruns can be associated with a lack of in-depth analysis and challenge at the planning and bidding stage. So this is when we can more easily change things. So we really do want to be doing this as early as possible because it is actually forming how we think. It might actually make some major changes to the project. So we also have unrealistic or overly optimistic plans, and we can identify where that occurs and we can challenge it at an early stage rather than leaving it into the last section. Going through the process, we can also identify, and this is very important, what you don't know and what you might need to focus on to end up with a more robust assessment of what the schedule and the project requires and what it's going to do. So, and finally, when we move to the latter stages of the project, continually revisiting your QSRA and updating it means that we tend to identify those activities and risks which are having the biggest impact on our schedule. And therefore, we can prioritize those and look at developing mitigation activities and addressing these issues. In other words, we become a major contributor to the successful management of the project. And at that point, that concludes what I have to talk about. And I would like to hand over at this stage to Graham Nicol. Hello.
Thank you, James. Okay, so I'm going to chat through the interpretation of QSRA reports or outputs and how to, one, understand what the model's telling you, but then two, to be able to present this to senior managers, decision makers, and to understand what the outputs are telling you. So, the interpretation of QSRA outputs and how they are reported is probably the most critical aspect of the QSRA process. Ultimately, it's telling decision makers that we need either additional contingency or the schedule has significant uncertainty or risk in it that needs to be addressed. As Tony and James have mentioned, a lot of work will have gone into producing the outputs. However, as said, QSRA outputs can be extremely sensitive if presented without the context or without challenge. So what are the challenges with QSRA outputs? Often, key messages can often be hidden away in lengthy QSRA reports. There is sometimes, let's say, a tendency to produce 40-page, 50-page QSRA reports that are not clear in terms of what the outputs are telling us. Also, there is an instance of talking in single P numbers, so i.e. the P50 confidence of achieving a certain date doesn't actually inform a decision. Decision makers struggle to grasp what QSRA outputs are telling them, and the value of the QSRA process is often lost in them. Often, when quizzed, practitioners can't explain what's driving analysis or what's gone into the model. So what does it boil down to? So going back to basics, ultimately it boils down to why do we do QSRAs in the first place? So we are doing QSRAs to inform contingency discussions and arrangements. talking around time risk allowance, building float into the schedule, revising, sequencing and logic, etc. That's what we're doing QSRAs for. They provide confidence and assurance regarding base schedules and their assumptions and integrity. They identify key risks to delivery and highlight sensitive areas within the project schedule. They provide a range of outcomes considering risk and uncertainty, and they model various scenarios considering what-ifs. Taking all of that in mind, there are key questions that a risk practitioner or the person responsible for the QSRA should consider and be crystal clear on when quizzed or questioned by decision makers or senior managers. Can they detail the quality of inputs that went into the model, i.e. similar to what James talked around and also Tony? Have the inputs been signed off by management or the interested parties? Are the uncertainty and risk inputs of a good quality? It's also key to understand what scenarios have been modelled and any assumptions and exclusions. So ultimately, as the project progresses, we are developing or basing our risk and uncertainty on a number of assumptions and exclusions. These have to be clear to senior management as a basis for how the QSRA model has been put together. As risk practitioners, we need to demonstrate that the QSRA process was iterative and involved all key stakeholders. So again, tying into what James said, we can't rush a QSRA model. If we are, then we're doomed to fail. We also need to involve all the key stakeholders. If we don't involve all the key stakeholders, we will then be questioned as to the validity of the QSRA model. And then finally, it's around understanding what are the base dates and the milestones that are being modelled against. It doesn't always have to just be the end date. Typically in infrastructure projects, for example, you're talking several years where the end date may not be relevant in terms of being modelled. So it's key to focus on or agree what the key milestones are that are being modelled and to then base that as your kind of delta or comparison for your QSRA model outputs. So what do typical outputs look like? So as James mentioned, there's a whole host of QSRA software applications out there. So the next few slides cover Safran outputs as well as a bit of PRA. So the typical outputs that we see, the first one is a distribution output. So taking an example schedule in QSRA, we see the first thing we see is the pre-mitigated output. And what this typically shows us is the percentage chance, so the gold arrow at the very bottom of this graph, is showing that we have a 1% chance, assuming that no mitigation is in place or is effective for the risks and uncertainty, and then considering a P50 output is some 534 days after base date. So what this ultimately would ring alarm bells around how robust is our schedule and have we modelled or over-egged risks to the extent that there would be such a delay if no risks were mitigated. However, then by following the risk process and modelling the potential impact or reduction in risk impact of mitigations, we're then presented with a bit more of an optimistic picture when we look at a post-mitigated position. So the post-mitigated position here now, we can see that the gold arrow has moved to 26% chance of hitting the base date. However, this is assuming that the identified mitigations are successful. That is one aspect a risk practitioner always challenge in terms of the validity or robustness of mitigations and the consequential reduction in risk exposure. And again, we can now see the P50 output, the blue arrow has reduced to July 2023 and is offering up a 260 days improvement in terms of outturn. What we also can do is we can analyse the two models side by side. So the purple or blue line, or S-curve, details the range of outcomes considering uncertainty and pre-mitigated risk, while the red line is outlining the uncertainty and post-mitigated risk. Again, we've highlighted P50 linked to the previous slide where there's a 260-day saving if the mitigations are successful. However, different clients may operate with different confidence levels, P80, 70, etc. What this very quickly does is highlight the range of outputs, and then how we can compare pre and post mitigated risk. The next output, and one we're probably all familiar with, is tornado graphs. So QSRA tornado graphs come in two forms. First, it's around the activities that are driving the finished state of the project. So these are the activities that are either on the critical path or close to the critical path, have the greatest sensitivity to uncertainty and risk. So when risks are mapped to these activities, they will have the greatest impact on the outturn of the model. So key questions when we are faced with the activities tornado graphs is so in this instance, is why are the delivery to site activities so sensitive to uncertainty and risk? The next question or the next challenge would then be around going back into the base schedule and looking at the logic around these delivery to site activities, understanding if have we appropriately assessed the uncertainty, have we mapped the right risks to these activities, or have we mapped too many risks in a given scenario to these activities? These are the sort of questions to ask and be prepared to answer when faced or when receiving these tornado graphs as an output from the QSRA. So similar to the activities output, we then receive the risks that are driving the output of the model. So again, taking the example QSRA, we've got 6 risks that are coming out driving the model. Ultimately, there are 2 that are most influencing the model. So again, what's causing these top 2 risks to drive the QSRA model? Be the obvious question to ask. Again, what activities has that been mapped to? And then I guess the next question is, what are our mitigations for these activities, these risks? What can we do to reduce them driving the QSRA model? Now, the next graph is a scatter graph. Typically, this is probably more linked to the integrated QRA where cost and schedule was brought together. But what we are presented with is that the users can then see that the determined combined probability of achieving given dates and completion dates, as well as to perform what-if analysis. So you can clearly see that looking across the X and Y axis, there's certain dates attributed to the model, and then the potential cost outputs. What this very quickly does is give you an understanding of all the different iteration outputs of the QSRA model. Very quickly I've rattled through the key outputs from a QSRA, but there are key points to take away in terms of interpreting QSRA outputs. As a practitioner, you have to be clear on what has gone into the model in terms of quality inputs. So James talked around the schedule check report, and so did Tony, in terms of the quality of the schedule has to be right from the start. Are we clear in terms of uncertainty ranges and how we've applied that to the activities throughout the schedule? And then there's the discrete risk. How have we applied that to certain activities? Have we assessed those risks accordingly as they would see fit within the schedule? The next one is then present ranges rather than single P numbers. So as said earlier on, there is a tendency to report only a single P number, so P50. So taking the example that before, if we presented a range, so say, for example, the P50 date in the example was July 23. However, if we considered what the P75 output was, which was December 23, we could turn around to senior management or decision makers and provide, I guess, a feeling or an output that would suggest if we went with P75, it would give us an additional 5 months time risk allowance. Those are the sort of conversations senior managers want to be having rather than P50 as a certain date. Present the delta of the analysis compared to base date. Always make sure your base date is, or your base data is the basis for what you've assessed QSRA, so you're able to compare the deltas and the analysis, or the impact of the analysis, and then be clear on pre and post mitigated positions. Why are certain risks more prominent than others? What drives reduction in the exposure from pre to post? As said before, sometimes you can see a very simplistic mitigation influencing or greatly reducing the risk exposure. The question there is this a robust mitigation that is actually going to reduce our exposure? And it's always about that challenge. And again, our mitigation is robust to merit the reduction of exposure. So that was just a quick run through in terms of the interpretation of QSRA reports or outputs. As said, they are very sensitive. You're ultimately telling or advising senior managers and decision makers of a need for either additional contingency, time risk allowance, or to revisit the baseline schedule. But hopefully that gave you a feel for the sort of questions and the sort of challenge you'll receive from decision makers and managers. And now I shall pass back to Tony to conduct the Q&A session.
Thank you very much indeed, Graham. This is Tony back here. I will now moderate the Q&A session. Obviously, myself, James, and Graham will pitch in answering the questions. So the first question we had was, are there different levels of undertaking a QSRA, especially in a small organisation where the PM, scheduler and risk manager are all the same person? My response, and I'll throw it over to James and Graham very shortly, would be, first of all, that's not a bad position to be in, because you are not going to be disagreeing too much with yourself. Secondly, in a small organisation, in terms of what we've described in terms of the QSRA approach, what you need to do, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a huge, great structure, project control team, risk management team behind you. You can do it to the degree of granularity, fidelity, to use some good management consultant speak, that you need to. You know, if a high level, quick, quick and dirty is good enough for a small organisation, that's great. Okay, it doesn't mean you can actually, you spend the time on the different elements of a QSRA that you have available, you have the expertise for. You don't necessarily have to go into all the depth that perhaps a larger, more mega project would do. I don't know if James and Graham,
Sure.
if you've got a question.
I guess the only thing I would add there, Tony, it would just be to challenge bias, I guess, where someone is ultimately covering or holding the three hats, is just challenge bias, and by doing that, you could, well, by facing that, you could get peer reviews or independent advisors to come in and challenge that. I guess that's the one thing I would responsible for all three aspects.
Yes, I would totally support that. Normally, obviously, you're challenging each other through this, but it actually, even if you are the same person, then you get somebody into, as Graham said, to peer review. And actually, even if you're in a large, very complex project, again, someone coming in to challenge, to ask those questions, etc., is not a bad sort of assurance tool, really, to do, just in case you are all fiercely agreeing with each other and actually possibly not following or being as in-depth as you should be. So that's really good. Okay, unless James has got anything he would like to pitch in on that, I'll detail the next question. I had a question here, is that, do we need a detailed cost-loaded program for QSRA, or cost elements, or for QSRA or cost elements are not reviewed in detail? James, could I perhaps pose that one, or ask you to comment on that one? Hello, James.
Hi there, Tony. Yes, I've just got myself unmuted here. Sorry, can you repeat that again?
That's not a problem. Do we need a detailed cost-loaded program for QSRA, or are cost elements not reviewed in detail as part of the QSRA?
I mean, there is a trend towards having an integrated cost-loaded resource-based schedule, which you can do a QSRA on. But at the end of the day, you don't need that information if you're just purely looking at the schedule and the schedule delays component of it. Quite often, as a midway step, you have the situation where you do that analysis and you basically take whatever prolongation at whichever confidence level that you're interested in, and you push that back into the cost analysis.
I'd support that. And just for all of those of you out there, I would have been talking about this at the end, and I will remind you, this is actually the first of 3 webinars around the whole subject of quantitative risk analysis that we're going to do. The next one will be on cost risk analysis, with the final one later this year being on what James has just referred to about an integrated cost and schedule risk analysis approach. But most definitely, just to support what James is saying there, is no, you don't really, because you're looking at the schedule. Okay. Cost elements are then reviewed through a CRA, and if you're doing an integrated cost and schedule risk analysis, obviously they're being reviewed there as well.
Yep, Tony, just one thing to note there when we talked around getting the sign-off or getting stakeholders with the integrated aspect, that there's even more onus on that to make sure that everyone is in agreement that the estimate aligns with the schedule then fits into that rolls into the QSRA or the integrated QSRA model. It adds onus on who needs to sign off an agreement before it's modeled.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really good point. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Graham. Sorry. I did have one very quick question here, and perhaps we do. Apologies if I didn't spell it out, but just in case, QSRA, because somebody did ask, QSRA stands for Quantitative Schedule Risk Analysis. So there you go. So the next question I have here was, how are you risking soft issues into the schedule or the QSRA? So, and the questioner says, by soft issues, I mean leadership, capability, mindsets, attitudes, and behaviours. I don't know if you, Graham, have you got anything you'd like to feedback on that question?
I guess this goes back to what I was talking around in terms of modelling scenarios. Is that, again, it won't be specifically attributed to activities, but you can start to model scenarios. So say, for example, delay in approvals or lack of management support. You can start to model that as a scenario where you're considering out there around capability, leadership, etc. You can pull out more detailed risks linked to that, but I would try and model a what-if scenario in that instance using QSRA.
Okay, that's good. What I would feedback on that about those softer issues, you know, with bias, etc., leadership capabilities, we do have to take into account in the overall way that risk management is done, and the way this, you know, obviously our scheduling colleagues are working and our cost management colleagues are working, about the views of leadership, the biases, how capable are we, etc. What are the attitudes and behaviours in terms of to risk management, and that goes all the way back to, you know, risk identification and management, etc. And so therefore it is something we have to consider when we're doing a QSRA, that there are all these soft issues there that could be and probably do influence the QSRA and its output, and that we do, again, as part of perhaps adding to the questions you need to ask yourself that Graham covered in terms of your outputs, take account of and show that, or explain that we do understand that obviously we are based here on a subjective process, risk management, but obviously can have different mindsets and attitudes towards it. Okay. Yes,
Tony, can I please add on that? Is that I think it comes back to the point that was made, that you don't just take your risk register and if it's got a schedule component in terms of an impact, just try and apply it. In that situation, what you'd be doing is you'd be looking at this softer item, which in the register says, oh, it can cause delays, and you would very much along the way Graham was describing it, is you would see where and which activities that might impact upon, and you would actually break that risk down, disaggregate it into something you can actually put into your model.
Yeah, it's a very good point there. Right, okay. Please, if your question doesn't get answered, we're just going to do one more, and we will answer all the questions because they are captured by the system, and then we'll come back to them. The last question I had here is, in terms of risk distribution, is there a preference or guideline? Oh, James, you were talking about risk. Do you have a preference for the risk distribution that you should have as a 3-point estimate on a risk?
I think everybody has their preferences, but I think that really one needs to get back to the type of data and the reliability, the quality of that data being gathered. And typically, the ones I listed, I think, were the triangular, which is one of my favorites because it's largely the simplest, and you're asking people a straightforward question, minimum, maximum. So you getting them to give you their widest distribution, but you do get situations whereby you might want to ask the question, optimism, is this an optimistic answer or a pessimistic answer? In other words, you're not asking them for the worst case, you're asking them in their opinion. So it sort of shrinks it down, and that might be more suited to a trigen type distribution. And if you end up with better quality data where you do something so often, and this might be in an M&E or an electronics type environment, you can actually have a better feel for the distribution. You might go for a beta PERT or something like that, where you're actually structuring that data better. But in my experience in should we say large infrastructure projects, quite often, particularly from an early stage, a triangular is probably as good as anything that you're going to be able to use.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, James. And okay, everybody, that does conclude the Q&A as part of the webinar. We had lots and lots of questions. As I've said a couple of times, we will be responding to those as part of the pack that will be put out onto the APM's website. So please keep an eye out there for those answers. Thank you so much. Well, I can't tell you how many questions I'm looking through and have selected. So thank you for that. We are now going to obviously conclude the webinar. Just as a reminder about the Risk SIG conference in Birmingham on the 26th of March, and about the evening student conference at UCL East Here campus in London this evening. Details of both of those on the APM website. Please go and look. Please go to the APM website, even if you're not a member. There is loads and loads of information on there that's really helpful for us as project professionals, with the APM being in the United Kingdom now the chartered body for project professionals. I'd like to thank my fellow presenters, James and Graham, for contributing today. I hope everybody has got out something from today, either one or two things because I'm experienced, or great, this has been a really good introduction for me into the subject. I'd like to thank Safran for sponsoring the webinar today, and we really hope you found this webinar engaging and supportive. So thank you for listening, and wherever you are in the world, have a good day. Goodbye.